Hi guys, I'm doing this video today. This is kind of a suggestion video from a subscriber, and we're going to talk about Scuzzy hard drives and Scuzzy devices, or SCSI. People call it Scuzzy for short. This isn't going to really be a comprehensive video, just kind of an overview of the different kind of drives, maybe why you'd want to mess around with Scuzzy, and I'll show you a couple drives in operation on a computer, and I'll show some footage of one of my computers with a lot of Scuzzy devices and how I have it set up in like the auto exec bat and stuff. So first we're going to talk about what Scuzzy is, some of the pros and cons, why you might want to look at a Scuzzy drive as an alternative to IDE, and then we're going to look at some in action. And I'll show you some various types too. So first, what is Scuzzy or SCSI? And it's kind of like the alternative to IDE, which is what most people are used to. Now Scuzzy stands for Small Computer System Interface. Yes, I think that's right. But anyways, this was kind of an alternative to IDE. It's been out for an extremely long time. I'm not sure if it actually came before IDE drives or ATA, but it's been around pretty much long time. I think like MFM drives came first and whatnot, but these were pretty early on. A lot of early computers used these. Apple used Scuzzy drives for a very long time, up until the 90s. A lot of times their computers exclusively used Scuzzy drives. So you'll find them a lot in old computers. A lot of Amigas use Scuzzy as well. So here's a quick look. This is your standard. This is an IDE drive. Now you can tell right away they pretty much look the same. At a glance you usually can't really tell. So hopefully my lighting isn't too bad, but here's the back of an IDE drive. This is the back of the IDE drive, so that you can see there's your IDE connector, and you have your jumpers. Really, these jumpers are only meant for selecting, you know, like slave, master, or cable select, or no drive, or only drive. And then you have your Molex Power. So this is a later one. This is a 133 ATA 133 drive, but they're mostly all the same. And here's your IDE cable, and it has one connects to the system, and then you have two for your two devices. So that's basically IDE. So let's talk about Scuzzy now, and why you might like it. So let's talk about some of the pros before I show you each individual drive. So pros of these drives, generally they're seen as being faster, and usually they do come in faster speeds. Now what I mean by speeds is there's a platter inside these, and it spins, and there's an arm, and that's how it works. So faster that platter spins, the faster you can get information. So generally these are known to be faster with reading and writing. I believe also the controller, how it interfaces with the computer itself and the motherboard, it takes a little bit of the burden off the CPU, so that helps too. But these generally come in faster speeds. So when you're talking about IDE, a lot of them are like 5,200, 7,200 RPMs, rotations per minute. Where usually with Scuzzys you'll get higher speeds. You'll get 10,000 RPM or 15,000 RPM for the really late fast ones. So generally they're a little bit fast. Now of course, if you have a newer high speed IDE drive and you put it up against like an old, early, slower Scuzzy drive, the advantage is probably still going to go to that IDE drive because it's much newer. But from the same era, in general, Scuzzy was generally seen as being faster. They're also seen as being a little bit more reliable. I'm not 100% sure on that, but these were usually used in things like servers and things. So they were seen to be a little bit more reliable in general. Again, this is just general stuff. Varies from drive to drive in manufacturers, so keep that in mind. So two big reasons you might want a Scuzzy drive is you can have more than two devices. So as we've seen with this IDE, these IDE cables generally had two connectors because IDE was limited to two devices per controller, or like the connector. So you'd have two hard drives, or a hard drive and a Cd-Rom drive. Now most motherboards later had two connectors, so you could have four devices total. Scuzzy, on the other hand, could have multiple devices per connector. Here is a later Scuzzy cable. Now, as you can see, there is a ton of connectors on it because you can have you could have anywhere from 1 to, I believe, 14 devices on one controller. So I mean, that's a good reason it was really popular with servers, because you could have tons and tons of hard drives with one Scuzzy controller. So another thing back in the day is Scuzzy was able to break the 500 megabyte barrier. So when you're running with a lot of DOS machines, depending on the BIOS, a lot of times you could put in something like this, which is 300 gigabytes. And if you did get it to work, unless you partition it up, you're really only seeing 500 megabytes. That's all it's going to see. So it's kind of a limit with DOS, a limit with a lot of the early BIOSes. Scuzzy can break that a little bit. You can usually get up to 2 gigabytes with a Scuzzy drive. You put in a Scuzzy controller, you hook up the Scuzzy hard drive, and generally DOS is going to see 2 gigabytes unless the drive is smaller than that. Now some drives or some controllers actually have a limit to like 1 gigabyte or something, so it really depends. But in general, Scuzzy can break that 500 megabyte barrier, which is important to a lot of retro gamers. If you want a big drive or you don't want to mess with partitions, that's pretty cool. So cons. What are a couple cons of these drives? The first two aren't really cons anymore with so many used and old drives and eBay and things like that. But generally at the time, it still applies a little bit today. They are a little bit more expensive in general, and they tend to be a little harder to find in general. A lot of these drives I actually found locally. So things like Craigslist and stuff. So I mean, and for a decent price. So I mean, that maybe doesn't apply so much anymore. But I mean, compared to IDE, which you buy pretty much any old computer, or not even necessarily old, but 10 or 15-year-old computer, or even older than that, you're almost always going to find IDE drives in them. So they're everywhere, very common. Not so much with Scuzzy, but in the information age, with eBay and things like that, they're not too hard to find anymore, but they are less common. So, a couple bigger things that I don't generally have a problem with, but a lot of people do. A lot of people find Scuzzy drives to be noisy. You'll see this in forums and stuff. It's a common complaint. I don't want to use Scuzzy drives. It sounds like a jet engine. It's loud. Again, it varies by manufacturer. I have had some drives that have been very noisy, and I've had other drives that have been whisper quiet. So it really depends. Sometimes it has to do with the higher RPM of the disk spinning. It creates a little bit more noise. But like I said, I've had drives that have been very quiet, and then some that have been pretty noisy. So really, it depends on your particular drive. And last thing, these Scuzzy drives, they do tend to be a little bit more temperamental, maybe a little bit harder to set up. Just sometimes you'll put them in a computer and they won't work, or they won't work right, and you put them in a different computer and they work fine, or there's different jumpers and things like that. It's just, I mean, I don't find them much harder to set up than IDE drives, but sometimes they can be a little temperamental, and you do usually need like an extra controller card, since a lot of motherboards do not have Scuzzy built in. Now when we get to other Scuzzy devices like Cd-Rom drives and like zip drives and stuff, you have to use a Scuzzy manager program, and I find that a little bit harder to set up than on IDE devices. So I'll talk about that briefly at the end of this video. I'll show you how I have one of my computers set up. So if we're talking about things other than hard drives, yeah, they tend to be a little bit harder to set up than their IDE relatives. So we'll just get to, this is a later controller. This is a PCI controller, and so you see it has 2 different connections. Scuzzy changed throughout the years, whereas on IDE, the cable changed at one point, but the connector pretty much stayed the same. Scuzzy went through a couple revisions where you need different connectors and different cables, so there is that to think about. This is the earlier 50 pin, and I believe this is the later, I believe it's 80 pin. But this is a later 90s PCI controller. I'll show you an ISA one later. So not too different from a IDE controller. There's also most of these have external ports for hooking up, external Scuzzy enclosures, which were fairly popular. So let's just take a quick look at some of the Scuzzy drives I have laid out here. So take a look at this middle one first. This is an Apple drive. It's a smaller and an older one, but this is what you'll typically see for vintage computers. So here's the back. So we've got no jumpers. Basically, you have a Molex and a 50-pin connector. Now, sometimes you'll have jumpers on the bottom. Yeah, there's some here, and these do various things, but hopefully if you're lucky you'll get one and you'll plug it in, it will just kind of work, it will be set up. When you want to boot from these, you want it to be set to device 0. Scuzzy devices have different numbers, so when you have a Scuzzy controller, you'll have ID device 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think 7 is always the number of the controller, 8, 9, and usually you set those through jumpers that are actually on the drive. So yeah, this is an earlier drive. This is what a lot of retro enthusiasts will be using, this 50-pin connector. And here's a 50-pin Scuzzy connector. This one only has one to the controller, so it only has one connector, but you'll find them with multiple ones as well. And it is bigger than the IDE one, so this is what you'll typically run into. Now here's a later IBM drive, and this is after the change. And this uses the 80-pin connector. So a little bit different, and that's what this big old cable here is. You'll also notice there's, at the end of it, I believe there's a terminator. Like not an Arnold Schwarzenegger terminator, but that's another thing with Scuzzy that you have to worry about. A lot of times you have to terminate the final device in the chain. So usually there's a jumper on these. So let's say all you have in your setup, you're just starting out with Scuzzy and you have one drive in there. There's usually a jumper to set it to terminate it. Since it's your only drive and it's the last drive in the chain, you want it to have the terminator set. I really haven't run into that problem a lot at all, so it sounds like it's more complicated, more steps, but I really wouldn't worry about it too much. So yeah, here's this drive. I think this is a 7,200 RPM drive. This is IBM. You'll find a lot of IBM Scuzzy drives. So this one though, the nice thing about it is it actually on the bottom tells you what the jumpers do, which is nice. Some drives don't do that. Now of course this camera is garbage, and it won't. There we go. So you get some different things. Terminate power. Here's where you set some of the IDs. You can set it 0, 3. The LED. I think there's an LED somewhere on this when it's working. You got more over here. Set and parity and stuff like. Most of these you don't have to worry about. I know it looks a little bit intimidating with all the new jumpers and stuff, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. I've had very little problems setting up Scuzzy usually. Alright, so let's look at our last drive. Alright, so the last one we have here, this is a much later one. I believe this came from a server, definitely sure, but this uses the last, I think it's the last kind of connector, and you won't see this much at all. Now as you see, there's no Molex Power connector on here. This runs, the power came straight through the cable. I'm not even sure what this is called, but I can tell you these generally are pretty fast. This one's actually pretty loud, but you can get an adapter for this. So you can get an adapter that hooks on and has like a regular, I think it's like a 50-pin or the 80-pin adapter. So this to like 80-pin, I believe that's it. Yeah, it's this connector to 80-pin, and it has a little power connector on it. So you can use these in regular setups. You just need the little adapter. But this drive is really fast. This drive is 15,000 RPMs on this drive. It's also it's about 40 gigabytes, and that's another thing I forgot to mention that's a bit of a downside. Compared to IDE, these drives tend to come in smaller sizes. If you're dealing with retro machines and DOS, that's not really a problem, but they do tend to come in sizes. This is a very late drive. I believe this is from the early 2000s, and it's only 40 gigabytes, which is still a lot for the time, I guess. But yeah, in general, these come in like really smaller amounts, like 10 or 5, when IDE was maybe double that was the norm. So, and then lastly, I just have a couple Scuzzy devices. There's a lot of devices you can find in Scuzzy format, which it's nice if you need more than, you're limited on how many IDE devices you can have. This is a Scuzzy Zip Drive, which I always found these interesting because the Scuzzy versions used the floppy power connector, where the IDE ones used the 4-pin Molex. So Again, you got your jumpers with terminators and whatnot, and you know, it tells you what to do and how to set the device number and stuff. And then we have, this is just a typical, this is a Sony Scuzzy Cd-Rom drive. So it uses the 50 pin, and it pretty much looks the same except for all those extra jumpers. So that's, you know, for setting the device IDs and things like that. I believe it tells you on here what they do. Yeah, this, you can only set this ID 0, 1, or 2, but it has a lot of little couple other options there. So all right, so let's just kind of take a look at one in action, and then I'll show you one that has, I have all kind of Scuzzy stuff set up on it. So all right, so here's just the first example of a Scuzzy device running in a setup. This is a very simple setup. The only thing I have running in here is the Scuzzy hard drive. Now this motherboard is, it's a 386 board, so AMD DX40, nothing too fancy. Actually, previously I had a 286 in here that I want to do a video on, but that board had the dreaded Dallas real-time battery issue where I couldn't get past post, so I actually removed that motherboard. I might try the whole CMOS mod on that battery. So I'm just going to advise in general, you kind of should go for Adaptec cards, just because they're pretty reliable, they're very common, and there's a lot of material out there, like manuals and things, so you can figure out the jumpers and stuff. So they're well documented in general. I know like some other cards, like Bus Logic, I believe, made Scuzzy controllers. There's a couple other, Future Domain, I think. Yeah, so there were a couple other, I think even SIG made some Scuzzy controllers, so there's other ones out there, but it just seems that Adaptec is kind of like the standard. They're like the Sound Blaster of, you know, Scuzzy controllers. So this one here, this is the AHA 1528B. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit there. You know, pretty well documented, well-known, common Scuzzy controller for the ISA bus. So you'll find this controller in a lot of old setups, and there's a lot of good documentation on it. Now I think this one in particular, it has a 1 gigabyte limit. I'm not sure about that, but you can change the BIOS to extend that limit. Again, I don't know a lot of the technical details on this, but from what I can tell, this card does have a 1 megabyte or gigabyte limit, which is better than, you know, that will still break your 500 megabyte barrier for hard drive use. But yeah, this one has a floppy controller, although right now I have it disabled. Actually, I have an onboard. I have another card with a floppy controller. I'm not quite sure why I did that, but yeah, I have another card with a floppy controller on it. Oh, this is the ISA controller card, but that part, it's just controlling my floppy right now. I don't know why I did that, but if you wanted to use the controller, the floppy controller on the card, you shouldn't have any problems with it. Now basically, I mean, I got lucky with this card, and it happens, I just kind of put it in, installed it, hooked it up to my 1 gigabyte Scuzzy hard drive, and it just worked. I know you can come into problems with these. Like I said, that's outside the scope of the video, but just some general tips. Make sure your boot device is ID 0 or possibly 1 in some instances, but I believe you want it as low as you can get, so 0. Make sure that you could have conflicts with other cards. I originally had a conflict with this card with my sound card. Then I had to adjust some jumpers on the sound card, change some resources, and then it worked fine. Keep that in mind. You know, try, if you're running into problems or freezes on boot, take out all your other cards, except maybe like your video card and your Scuzzy controller, and then see if it works. And then kind of go from there, figure out where the conflict is. I've also read some things like in BIOS, you want to enable like shadow RAM. I've also heard other instances where you want to disable it. I've never run into those situations, but just keep it in mind that there could be some other little conflicts that happen. That's why some people say that these might be a little fussier than IDE controllers in general. Again, that word in general. It has a little, here's your header for the LED light. It's a 4-pin, but if you have a 2-pin, you just play around with it till you find where it works. So I'm just going to install this, and then I'll show you the boot up process for this machine. Because I'm only using the hard drive, I don't need to add any like Scuzzy drivers for Scuzzy Manager or anything. You just install the card, use the 50-pin cable to hook it up to the 50-pin Scuzzy hard drive, which is down here, and mine started right up. I mean, after I figured out the sound card conflict, it works just fine. So I'll show you that process, the boot process. Alright, so here's the machine. I've got the Scuzzy card, I reinstalled it. This case, one of those older cases, has a big old giant power switch. So I just want you to get a feel for the sound of this drive. I don't think this one's too loud, but some people, like I said, find Scuzzy drives to be louder, but oops, I guess I need to plug it in first. Alright, well, let's try this with the power cord actually plugged in. So I think that's beeping because, of course, my CMOS battery is dead on a lot of my old boards. Yeah, I don't think it's really any louder than an old IDE drive, if you can hear it. I mean, you can definitely hear it. It's not whisper quiet, this one in particular, but I don't find this one too much, too much louder than an old IDE drive from the era. Maybe a little bit, but like I said, it all varies by manufacturer. You know, the drive, depending on the drive, some are real quiet, some are really loud. So this one's okay. It's not too bad. So let me just show you the boot process for this one. So here we go. Here's the post screen of that machine booting up. As you can see, there's the BIOS for the Scuzzy that comes on, and it detected it at as device 0. Now, like I said, originally it would freeze at that point, and then I found out I had a conflict with my sound card. But after I figured that out, it booted right up. Of course, I had to install DOS to it. You did it just like you do with an IDE drive, and it worked fine. No real problems after that. So I do want to show real quick. This is just a program called Check It, and just for fun, we'll run a benchmark here on that Scuzzy drive. Now, unfortunately, I was too lazy to pull the drive out and tell you the make and model because I don't remember. But I just figured we'd do a check, just a general benchmark. I don't have an IDE drive to compare it with, though, so I guess it's not very good, benchmark. But there you could see the numbers. If you're familiar with these kind of drives, maybe you'll find that interesting. It does seem to beat the pants off whatever they consider a general IBM PCXT hard drive. Alright, so here is my decked out Scuzzy 386. This is kind of like my main 386 system. If you guys watch my anatomy of a 386, it is the same motherboard and parts inside here. In that video I had it in a smaller case, and I recently transferred it to this kind of taller case, just because I kind of like this case more, and it has it has the LED. The other one I don't think had one, or it wasn't working. I do have an AMD 40 in here, 38640, but I have the oscillator cut down so it's 25 megahertz, so I'm planning to play some Wing Commander on this one. Has this cool, it's a little hard to move up, especially one-handed, but so you know, a little shielding there. It has this weird 386 sticker. Those look like buttons, but they're not, although that would be cool to like set the LED with little buttons. That would be convenient, but it's not. It's just a cover. But anyways, yes, this thing has a Scuzzy hard drive in here. It also has this Scuzzy Zip Drive. If you're wondering why it's that off-white and you didn't watch my anatomy of a 386 video, it's because I painted it white. It was that purple like you saw in that earlier Scuzzy drive. Really don't know what they were thinking when they made these things purple. It just looks hideous, and I think it looks slightly less hideous poorly painted white. And also has a Scuzzy Cd-Rom drive. So I'm going to show this machine posting and the process it goes through, and then I'm just going to show you what my config file looks like and my auto exec file looks like, and I'm going to show you the README real quick for the drivers. Now, for anything other than a Scuzzy hard drive, you are like an IDE device. For the most part, you're going to need drivers. So you're going to need, really only need, I believe it's just one driver. There's usually like a Scuzzy device manager driver, and that's controlling both these things, or really any Scuzzy device you hook up. So, you know, again, we're not going into super detail, but I'll just show you how this computer specifically I have set up. Alright, so here we are in my machine's BIOS. The battery was dead, so I had to do this anyways. But make sure you don't set anything in the BIOS for hard drive. So where it says like hard disk C and D, set nothing. The Scuzzy controller takes care of all that. It's a completely separate thing. So just leave those blank. And so here we go with the post. 16 megabytes, and there's this is a different controller in this card than the other machine. That was pretty quick. And then you see all that. That is the Scuzzy Manager driver taking care of everything. You can see the hard drive listed, which you didn't need a driver for, and then you can see the zip drive and the CD drive and the ID 2 and 5. It didn't have to be 2 and 5. That's just what I set it at. Okay, so now I'm just, after I can spell it right, I'm going to go use the edit command, and I'm going to show you what my bat.bat and my system config files look like. Now keep in mind I did install the Scuzzy drivers into a directory, Scuzzy, so they're already on the hard drive. I think we're going to look at the auto exec bat first, and it looks pretty normal, just like a normal setup. It's just a little bit different down, you know, for the Scuzzy. That is for the CD-ROM drive. Still use MSC DEX, but there's a line afterwards to tell it where the point for the Scuzzy driver controller, whatever it is. Yeah, right there. Now that may vary depending on your controller card, what you put there. I'll show you a minute where you can find the information on that. So we're going to look at the configs. Remember, these setup, this is for specifically mine. Your system, how it's set up, may vary slightly. But 2 device lines down there at the bottom. That's just basically, you know, telling it where the driver is, or the Scuzzy Manager. It's in my Scuzzy folder or directory. And like I said, I think mine's using ASPICD1. That could change depending on your controller card, and you can find that out through README. There's just showing you my directory where I put all the Scuzzy stuff. So I'm going to go back into edit, and I'll just show you, to look at the README. The README should come with the drivers. There it is right there. And just reference these. You know, I'd never touched a Scuzzy drive in my life, and I figured out how pretty much through reading the README files. So it will tell you like your model and then what you need to put in. Like there's ISA bus ones, and there's you know, the different models, and then it will show you, you know, like ASPI 2 or 1 or 4, you know, depending on that. And if you keep scrolling down more too, it will tell you, like, you know, all about where to put it. There wasn't like an install program that set it up for me, so you have to, I don't know if there is now or if you can find one, but for this I did it all just by looking at that, figuring it out. So in the end, you know, as a retro PC enthusiast, is Scuzzy something that you should mess around with? Yeah, I mean, I say sure. It's hardly a necessity for a vintage computer, but you know, it's kind of cool to fool around with. It's not too difficult once you get used to it, especially if you're just doing the hard drive. Like I said, it lets you add multiple hard drives. Now you can, I didn't mention it earlier, but you can break that 500 megabyte barrier on an IDE hard drive if you use something like software, like dynamic overlay programs or things like that. But you know, that's, you know, do you want to mess around with those programs that may or may not cause, you know, weird incompatibilities? Nothing comes to mind. I've used them on drives and I've never had problems, but with all the variations of setups, there might be a situation where using an overlay program could cause issues. I've never run into them, but you know, if you want to go with a hardware kind of solution to that, Scuzzy's always a good bet. Like I said, in general, from the same era, they do tend to be a little bit faster and maybe more reliable. I think as we kind of leave the DOS era of retro computing, they kind of become a little bit less important, or, you know, the impact of their, you know, increased speeds are maybe a little bit less important as, you know, as we start getting into to ATA 66 and 100 and 133 and you know, even SATA drives later on. I'm not sure, you know, how they really stack up against Scuzzy. Scuzzy becomes a little bit less important, but for a pure like DOS retro rig, I think they definitely have their place. If you're willing to put a little bit more effort into finding one and messing around with it, you know, they definitely, one big advantage is they do give you more space pretty easily, you know, bigger drives in DOS. I've used them in a number of old computers. Haven't really had many problems. Like I said, really the only bit of issue where you have to start playing around is if you're adding other things like CD-ROM drives and zip drives, because then you have to mess around with device managers and drivers, which isn't really a big issue. So, you know, it's not a vital component by any means, but Scuzzy is pretty cool to put in a retro computer. It does give it a little extra cool feel to it. Also, like I said, a lot of things like Amigas, old Amigas, and Macintoshes and stuff, they did use Scuzzys almost exclusively in some cases. So if you're messing around with those kind of systems, you might want to get a little bit familiar with Scuzzy drives, because that will help you in those situations. So there is that as well. So thank you for watching. Like I said, it's just a general overview. Didn't want to get too technical or into, you know, minute details and stuff, but hopefully it just gives you kind of a general overview if you're completely unfamiliar with Scuzzy. So again, thank you for watching. Actually today, as I'm making this video, I've hit 486 subscribers, which is pretty cool. Didn't really expect you know, to get it's taken about a year. I know there's some channels that blow up, but you know, that's never really been a priority for me. I think it's cool that that amount of people actually find interest in this kind of just pointing a camera and talking videos. So I hope along the way I've helped people discover retro computing. So thank you for watching. I'll keep making videos for you guys, and again, thanks again for watching.